Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Braden Foldenauer. I'm a freshman at the college studying government, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note your exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK street side. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag Hassett Forum, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our honored guest, Kevin Hassett, today's moderator, Jason Furman, and Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, Doug Elmendorf. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm delighted this afternoon to be welcoming you to the Malcolm Wiener Lecture on International Political Economy. This lecture is made possible by the generosity of our friend Malcolm Wiener. Malcolm has been a stalwart champion of the Kennedy School for more than 30 years. Thanks to his commitment to our mission and to our work here at the Kennedy School, we have not only the Wiener Lecture, but also the Wiener Center for Social Policy, 2 Malcolm Wiener Professors of Public Policy, the Wiener Auditorium, and support for a number of special projects that we do here. Unfortunately, Malcolm cannot be with us today because he is in Modena, Italy, I'm told, examining Bronze Age dwellings with a leading Italian archaeologist. And it turns out that Malcolm is a respected scholar of Aegean prehistory. He sends me his papers sometimes, and I endeavor to read them. Later stop on his trip now in Europe, he will be inducted into the Academy of Athens, which is Greece's most lauded research organization. So Malcolm is pursuing his own scholarly interests right now. But fortunately, we are joined by his wife Carolyn and daughter Kate, and we're delighted to have them here. Please join me in thanking the Wiener family for their support. Thank you. The Wiener Lecture in International Political Economy features distinguished economists and policymakers from around the world. Previous speakers in this series include Lael Brainerd, Governor of the Federal Reserve, Henry Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury, Mario Draghi, President of the European Central Bank, and Muhammad Yunus, winner of the 2006 Nobel Prize and the founder of Grameen Bank. Today, we are honored to be joined by another distinguished guest, Kevin Hassett. Kevin is the chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Prior to accepting this role, Kevin spent a number of years at the American Enterprise Institute, where he was at various times the James Q. Wilson Chair in American Culture and Politics, Director of Research for Domestic Policy, Director of Economic Policy Studies, and a resident scholar. Kevin has been a formal or informal advisor to a tremendous number of elected officials, policymakers, candidates for office over the past few decades. Before going to AEI, Kevin was a senior economist at the Federal Reserve Board and on the faculty of the Columbia University Graduate School of Business. Kevin's especially noted for his expertise and work in public finance. And I should also explain that my wife and I have been friends of Kevin's and his wife for, I think, almost 25 years at this point. Now, today's lecture... We met in kindergarten. Yeah, exactly. Today's, quote, lecture will actually be a conversation between Kevin and Jason Furman, and we will leave plenty of time for your questions as well. Jason is a professor of practice here at the Kennedy School. He is Kevin's predecessor as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Jason served in that role from 2013 to 2017 under President Obama. Before that, he had worked as a key economic advisor for President Obama from before President Obama's first election through his time as president. Earlier in his career, Jason was a fellow at the Brookings Institution, was at the World Bank, and worked in economic policy in the Clinton administration. And for really full disclosure, we've been friends with Jason and his wife for more than 20 years as well. Maybe that just reveals a small set of people who work in economic policy. Or you might reveal a terrific set of people who work in economic policy, or maybe some of both. But we are honored and delighted to have Kevin with us today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jason Furman and the Wiener Lecturer on International Political Economy, Kevin Hassett. Thank you.
So thanks so much for that. And Kevin, we're really grateful that you came up here to Harvard, where not everyone agrees with every single thing you have to say. They don't even agree with everything I have to say, is one of the problems with it. Mm-hmm. Wanted to mostly talk about economics, but before we got to that, wanted to get to the question that probably everyone here is most interested in.
Why the socks, right? Why the orange socks?
Why the orange socks? Yeah. Which is how you came to work at the Council of Economic Advisors, and what is it like to work in this White House?
Oh, yeah, thanks Jason, and thanks to the Kennedy School, to Doug and Karen. Doug didn't mention that when my oldest son was born, he just graduated from Columbia last year. He was at the Columbia Women's Hospital for a couple of days after he was born, and the very first person, other than the doctors, to meet my baby, and Christy's baby, was Karen, because Karen was on bed rest with her twins that weren't quite cooperating, I guess, at the time. And so it's really an honor to be here with you guys. And, I had worked on 5 presidential campaigns going back, to McCain. I was the main advisor for McCain in 2000. And Greg Mankiw kind of helped a little bit with that campaign. The joke I like to tell is that 2 of the 5 campaigns won, which means that I'm like the Ted Williams of American politics, right? At batting 400. But I had decided, if you go online, I actually encourage people at the Kennedy School to try this, that I was going to leave politics and stop doing it, and instead focus on developing open source web tools that solved the problem that I had as an advisor always, which is that we had candidates that wanted to explore public policy ideas, but we didn't have the whole Joint Tax Committee and CBO and everything to tell us what the score is, what's the distribution. And so Matt Jensen and I at the American Enterprise Institute started this thing called the Open Source Policy Center, which is kind of like a virtual Joint Tax Committee. It was an enormous project. You know about it. I can remember we came over and trained the CEA to use the tax brain so that you too could simulate stuff a little bit more than CEA had the capability. And so I thought that I was out of politics altogether, and I think that it's kind of like maybe a Buddhist lesson in life, that once you stop wanting something, then you get it right away. So what happened was that after the convention, the Trump administration, now mid-administration there, the Trump nominee, had some friends of mine that were helping him, and then they sort of said, hey, could you show us how to use this tax brain thing? And so I started training them to use our open source stuff, and then after the election, they invited me to join. And then I did what I always do. I guess maybe not everybody here does it this way, but I just prayed about it, and I kind of felt like that I was supposed to do it. I don't know why. And seemed like a bad judgment then. Probably still seems like a bad judgment, but it certainly has been a rush. And how has it worked to work at the Trump White House? It's not at all like you think. Because I watch TV a little bit, not much, but the way it works for me is I show up every day. I'm surrounded by people that I really like to work with. I go to the senior staff meetings with General Kelly and those people, and everybody's really nice to me. Nobody's leaking bad stories about me to the press. We're working on really important things, serving our country, and our spirits are high. And I would say that the one emotional trying time really is every time somebody leaves. Sometimes they leave on purpose, sometimes they leave not on purpose. But if you work at a place, as I have since June, and you work under the pressure that we work under, the hours that we work, you become really close friends with everybody. I'm sure you remember. You have friends. Yeah, you have friends. And so that's the one trying thing for me. It's like, so Gary Cohn left this week. I grew very close with Gary Cohn. I'm really sad to see him go. I'm glad Larry's there. Larry Kudlow's a good guy, but that's the hard part. The hard part is just the turnover. I don't think I've ever been in an organization where people are leaving once a month or something, like very important people.
Mm-hmm. I certainly spoke at hundreds of going away parties in my 8 years in the Obama administration. wanted to ask you a question. It's something that Greg wrote an op-ed on, which is how much control presidents have over the economy. How much can you look at the GDP numbers under President Obama and infer something about his policies from that? Q4, we got a great GDP number. What does that tell us about the president's policies? If we get a bad number for Q1, should that change our conclusion about President Trump's policies and their impact?
I think the president matters a lot, but that it's very often the policies that they set in motion in their first couple of years. I think, when you were there, I know I worked with you closely at times to try to help you with some of President Obama's objectives, and I don't remember us being very successful at that. And, I think that some of the things that the president wanted to do. So, for example, President Obama, this was an off-the-record lunch when we did this, and so I never spoke about it, but Luigi Zingales spoke about it this year. Did you notice that I had a long conversation at that lunch with President Obama about the corporate tax? And he decided he wanted to cut it to 28%. It wasn't quite as far as I wanted to go. But if President Obama would have been successful there, then the outrageously optimistic numbers that you accused me of generating, I would have generated for President Obama. But he didn't. And so I think that the problem is the president doesn't always get to do exactly what he wants. It doesn't become law. And so, how fair is it to, hold President Obama accountable for the massive outflow of corporate investment and the transfer pricing and all the things that I've written so much about at CEA, given that he was trying to fix it and, he didn't have a Congress that cooperated. And so I think it's something that, as economists, we should be very skeptical of. I notice, every time there's a campaign, people put out studies where they average GDP growth by Democrats and Republicans and so on. And I think that our models, have many more variables than that.
But if you were just trying to do a signal to noise, what do you think the variance is in quarterly GDP? How large do you think the effect of a policy is? The tax reform, how much will that add to growth?
Or let me say it a different way as a question to you, because we've had a pretty public and collegial debate. And I should also stop and just thank you to Jason, because one of the hardest parts about serving your country is that before you do that, you got to get hazed by the Senate. That my Senate hazing went a lot smoother because you worked so hard to help me. But I think that the bottom line is that I think that since we took office, that the OECD and the average for the NABE, everybody's outlook for growth over the next couple of years has gone up a lot, like about 1%. I think that the CEAs under President Obama collectively forecasted 88 years of GDPs, and the GDP came in above your forecast twice, and one of the years was last year, when President Trump came in and sort of did whatever he did to sentiment and everything else. And so I guess the question is, when the OECD goes from 2 to 3, when the NABE goes from 2 to 3, when the median economist now thinks that 3% is possible again, then to what extent do you think it's fair to say that, hey, yeah, maybe this Trump guy's onto something? Because I think there's something there. I agree that science in the end is going to have to establish it with rigor and controlled experiments and everything else, but I think there's a mood change in America that's related to our policies. And so would you disagree?
Well, thank you for asking a question, because I can make a statement rather than framing it as a question, which when we get to all of you, none of you will have the right to do the same. I guess I would argue that if you look at the IMF forecast, for example, and look at the forecast they made in October 2016, they've revised those forecasts up for everyone. Their upward revision was larger for Japan and the euro area than it was for the United States. Markets in those places measured in dollars outperformed markets in the United States, and the growth rate in 2017 turned out to be the third highest growth rate of the last 5 years. So we did overperform, but we overperformed in a way that was sort of well within the range of what we'd been experiencing in recent years, and seemed to me to be more part of a global resurgence, a lot of it being led by Europe and Japan doing a lot better than expected, rather than something here. And the last thing I'd say is that there's no, even if you think the tax plan would make a big difference, I would expect that difference to start showing up this year not to have had a big effect in Q2 of 2017?
So the one thing about that is that so let's just forget about maybe we're practicing numerology instead of economics, but CEA said that the effect of the tax bill this year would be to increase growth by 0.3 to 0.5. You disagreed with that number. The NABE just surveyed their economists for their outlook for this year after surveying last fall before they had the tax bill. And they said that GDP growth this year is going to be 0.4 higher because of the tax bill. So I think that there's at least a null model under which the positive growth that we're seeing is consistent with the policies, not to mention the regulation stuff and other things that we could talk about. But I think that right now we're in a world where we're going from a place where we were sure that we'd be stuck at 2% for a good long time or worse. There are a lot, CBOs are the ones, to a world where we wonder whether this 3% thing that everybody is seeing can be sustained. And I think that that's a trade, just even to that world, that people, if presented with that trade a couple years ago, would have taken. And I think I think a lot of it's attributable to stuff that President Trump has done.
Right. So let's talk about where that growth would come from going forward. In 2017, about half of our growth came from the employment rate improving, either the unemployment rate falling and labor force participation on an age-adjusted basis improving somewhat. Mm-hmm. The first question would be, how much more scope is there for continued improvements in the labor market? And the second
Can we do one question at a time, too?
Sure.
Because this is something that we wrote a lot about in the economic report, because there's been this big decline in labor force participation, and it's a key factor driving pessimism about the economy, because where are the workers going to come from? And I think I remember the number right, almost surely do, that you guys anticipated that it would continue over the next 10 years at about 0.4 a year on average. I think that number is correct. And so this year, because the labor market was very, very strong, which in part was continued momentum and then maybe accelerating a little bit, the labor force participation, instead of declining 0.4, went up 0.2. And so outperformed what you guys thought by 0.6. That's a big change, right? That's not just a blip. And I think there are a lot of reasons why that we go into in the economic report of the president, why we don't need to be quite so pessimistic about labor force participation, that there are a lot of things that happened over the last decade that discouraged it that we can fix. And about half of it is the retirement of the baby boomers, and half of it is policy. And so I think that we can continue to get that sort of 0.2 a year, which would be much more than we have in our base case forecast in the economic report as well. So that if we keep getting years like this year, then growth will be higher than we say, which averages about 3 over the next 10.
So the two ingredients of growth are labor and then the amount you can produce per hour, which is productivity. Mm-hmm. That's been slowed down across all the advanced economies starting around 2005. Mm-hmm. It's run at about 1.1% in the last decade in the United States, and it was that same rate last year. It didn't do any better. Why are you so optimistic that can increase a lot? And again, how much does that have to do with policy versus other factors?
Well, you and I have talked about this at the AEA meeting, so you've heard me say this, and so you probably even had a good answer then, but you probably have a better answer now. But the thing that struck me about the sort of 4 years before we went in and started having to help devise policies was that profit growth was great, wage growth was terrible, and the contribution of capital deepening to productivity growth went negative for the first time since the Second World War, even though we weren't so it was kind of like slow growth recovery. And so how is the contribution of capital formation going negative? And I think, this year it turned positive again, but it didn't go back to average levels. But I think with the decline in the user cost of capital, or the tax changes that we made that make people want to invest in the U.S., that we can go back to about normal levels of capital deepening. And I think that gives us productivity. I think that we were pretty cautious about how much we get out of it, because I can remember back when I was hanging out at the NBER in grad school, and you had a dog named Keynes. Is Keynes is probably not still. What's your dog's name now?
Tobin.
Tobin. Okay. Yeah. Friedman will be the next one, maybe. But anyway, I just think that when I think back to what we were studying in grad school, one of the things that was like a hot area in macro was that when there's more capital spending, then there seems to be more total factor productivity change too. It's the whole endogenous growth literature was like a baby literature when we were in grad school. But it started with the stylized fact that when you get an investment boom, like we're actually starting to see, then total factor productivity growth seems to mysteriously go up as well, which is not a thing that we put into our forecast, but I think that it's something that could contribute to even more growth than we've seen. But again, we've made one forecast that's been tested by the data, and we were low. And I think that the data have been surprising us on the upside. One other thing you said, one question. There's one other thing you said that when do we expect to see the tax effects? If you go pour through the data, you see massive tax effects already in the fourth quarter. There appears to have been anticipatory capital spending because the expensing was retroactive to the end of September. And there was also a massive amount of income timing. So here in this audience, I know I can actually discuss at length the statistical discrepancy because you guys all know about that, but there's going to be a lot of really weird stuff in the NIPA data because the income was moving around and the capital spending began in the fourth quarter. And also there was a big surge in imports because people wanted to expense at the higher corporate rate in the fourth quarter. And so we're already seeing the tax effects in the data.
So another area of policy is regulatory policy. And regulatory policy, the centerpiece of it is cost benefit. Costs are usually costs for businesses. Benefits are usually benefits for society. The way your administration talks, it always sounds like you're trying to maximize growth, not trying to do a cost benefit calculation. Is that correct? And are there trade-offs that we have to make in economic policy? Is it sometimes worth giving up some growth to achieve some other objective?
We have a chapter on regulation in the economic report of the president too, and I think that chapter is very frustrating for data guys like us to deal with regulation because measures of regulation are so hard to develop, and one of the things that you sometimes see people do empirically is use the number of pages in the Federal Register of Regulations, disregarding the fact that if we withdraw a regulation, that requires more pages in the Federal Register, and so it's not really that good a measure. But if you look at that literature, which we do, then even with these really terrible measures, like the cost of doing business index of the World Bank, I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying that regulation is such a difficult thing to measure. The OECD has a measure too of like the product market regulation, that there appears to be a really big link between what the regulatory costs of a country are and economic growth. And regulatory costs in the U.S. over the last decade were growing at about 8% a year. Thomas Piketty would have a lot of fun with that growth. It means we're all regulation in the long run. We have the example in the economic report that if we change our level of regulation to that of Germany, given the OECD modeling, then we get an extra 0.1% of GDP growth a year. And if we go all the way to being as, reckless about regulation as the Netherlands with my orange socks, then you get 0.2% a year of growth. And so I don't think anyone's saying that we need to go back to having dark satanic mills running amok in our villages. I think that regulation has probably gone too far in the U.S. and that, the OIRA is, by law, they have to do cost-benefit analysis, but they're going back and they're looking and they're trying to find things to roll back. The thing that I find that was one of the biggest surprises last year is that when the administration stopped new regulations, pretty much stopped them, right? There were almost no new regulations last year, and they, actually pulled back on a bunch of them. Then right around when they did that, business sentiment, it started skyrocketing. Like small business sentiment is about as high as you've ever seen. And I talked to a lot of businessmen about, so why are you guys, feeling so good about this? And they said, oh, well, new regulations have a very disproportionate cost on what we do because the old regulation, this would be a great dissertation topic, by the way. So the old regulation is something that we figured out 5 years ago. We had to hire all these lawyers and engineers, and they, told us, we have to do this, we have to do that, and we're doing it now, and it's kind of like a sunk cost. But the new regulation means that we have to hire all those guys again this year. And the fact that we don't have all these new regulations distracting us means we can focus on our business and focus on expanding it. And so that's why I think we've seen the sentiment effects. But I don't think that what we're saying is that we need to go back. Like, obviously, clean air is a good thing, clean water is a good thing, and we don't need to go back to the days when the U.S. was so terrible at regulation.
Right. I mean, when we teach regulation...
It was Richard Nixon, a Republican, that started the EPA, right?
When we teach our students about regulation, we do very little in the way of growth analysis. What we do is, what are the costs? Businesses have to install an extra scrubber. What are the benefits? These lives are saved. How do you weigh those two against each other? I've heard very little from you about those benefits and about the trade-offs. How would you do it, for example, with climate change and carbon emissions? Or how would you think about trade-offs?
No, you have seen a lot from us on this, but let's even go to, I would say that if you did a news search and you looked for the thing that the CEA did since I got there that got the most press, it would be our estimate of the cost to society of the opioid crisis. And we had the number of 500 billion, and the 500 billion in 2016. And the 500 billion it was a much higher number than anyone had ever had before, because we discovered the people that had looked at the cost of the opioid crisis had never included a value of life, which is something you teach at the Kennedy School all the time. So if we're deciding whether to have a guardrail or not, then we look at the cost of the guardrail and the lives saved, and then we have a value of life, which is an accepted use. And the 500 billion is just applying the value of life to the opioid costs. And now there are benefits to opioids too, that people who have pain are relieved from them, but they can become addicted to them. And so I think that for sure we're doing cost-benefit analysis all the time. But the specifics of going into individual regulations and doing cost-benefit analysis is not the CEA's job. That's the OIRA's job, and Naomi's doing that.
But if it was something like the Clean Power Plan for carbon emissions, for example, how would you think about cost and benefit there?
You guys did put out a report on that, and I learned a lot, and I know that a long time ago, Greg made me one of the founding members of the Pigou Club, I think. Right? It's true. And so there was a lot in your report that I liked, but I kind of agreed with Rob Stavens that there were some things that were in that report that I didn't like using the global benefit. I think that the U.S. cost-benefit analysis should depend on our own costs and benefit. And in your cost-benefit analysis of the Clean Power Plan, most of the benefit to the U.S. From it was from reduced particulates, and better lung health and stuff. And those are serious things. But it wasn't that you guys put out a report that had this massive benefit from climate change. And we haven't written our own report in that space, but maybe it's something that'll come up in the next academic.
I mean less the report, more how you. But we can move on from climate change. You emphasized increases in business confidence as one of the things that turned around last year and helped propel the economy. Lately, all the headlines are about the highest level of uncertainty as measured by the Bloom Index for this president as compared to any previous president, 2 stock market corrections, and just every morning you wake up with the president tweeting about some company and that being perceived to be driving the market for that day, whether or not it is. We could debate. Do you think the president is contributing to uncertainty right now, and does that worry you about its impact on some of the good things you talked about?
Let's think about, let's go right at the issue that's in the press right now, trade. That we have a chapter in the economic report. I'm sorry, I sound like I don't get any profits from this, the sales of this book. But we have a chapter that details, something that I'm sure that is the subject of classes here, that there's a massive amount of asymmetry in trade practice around the world. The U.S. doesn't have the lowest tariffs, but we have about the lowest tariffs. And there are a lot of countries, like, the President mentions the 10% tariff on U.S. autos sold into Europe. We have a 2.5% tariff on European autos sold here, but why don't they just lower it to 2.5%? And so and I was talking with some of my friends at the OECD who model this and are, I think, preparing an analysis of this, that if every country on earth adopted U.S. trade practices, what do you think would happen to global GDP? And the answer is it would go up a lot, because there'd be so much more trade. If the world dissolved into a 1930s style trade war, which we're not going to do. There's lots of active negotiations going on. Then that would move in the opposite direction. And so I think that if you're starting out in a world where we have, remember, we started in a world where everybody said, secular stagnation, the new normal, we're going to grow 1.5% forever. And then if you analyze policies and find that there are things that have to change, then there's going to be uncertainty about that. Is it going to change? Is it not? Are we going to get everybody moving towards the US, or are we going to get something else? I think each one of those things adds uncertainty, but when you're starting from a bad place, sometimes uncertainty is helpful because it means that we're trying to change things. We're trying to make them better. And the president is definitely focused on change. He was focused on change in regulation, in tax policy, in infrastructure. I mean, we could go down the list, and in trade. But he's a free trader. His objective is to get people to mimic our policies.
What would be the effect?
And that would be a positive, you have to admit, right? If everybody around the world adopted U.S. trade policy, that would be a positive for world GDP. You have to concede.
I guess the thing that confuses me the most about what you're describing for him is the way to get there, I think, is these multilateral approaches. And he has gone against multilateral approaches to trade, wanting to go country by country. And how can you succeed vis-a-vis China if you can't get our allies on board together with us, and we're actually dividing ourselves from them on the issue?
So because steel policy has been, within the focus of the White House and the public lately, I went back and studied steel policy of previous administrations. There's been a lot of really odd behavior by foreign countries and foreign companies in steel for a long time. It's extremely aggravated just about every president. If you look at the Korean free trade deal, it kind of essentially, with non-tariff barriers, made it impossible for U.S. automakers to sell cars into Korea. There are things that we agreed to that we should know. So anyway, so I just think that if we look, that a lot of presidents in the past wanted to fix this stuff. They saw it, they didn't like it, and they failed. And President Trump has his approach, and I think that we should hope that it works, because if it does, it'll be good for global utility.
If you ask the OECD what would happen if the U.S. eliminated tariffs and no one else did anything, would that be a plus or a minus for the U.S. economy and the global economy?
Yeah, I guess that their model would say that it's a plus, because anytime you reduce tariffs. And I think that, but also Otter and Schutt and a lot of famous economists with tenure here at MIT would tell you that would cause a lot of really concentrated harm in the towns where the factories closed, because they were just barely surviving because of the protection, and then when you remove it, then you create these pockets of despair. And that, by the way, I hope we can return to at least once before we open for questions.
We're definitely going to.
Because that's been one of the things that I've worked on the longest, that was part of the tax bill, that I think has received too little attention, is all the distressed community stuff that we have in there.
Right. But trade for another moment. We have a 25% tax on pickup trucks coming from Europe. They have a 10% tax on our autos. Do you think Europe's unfair on trade vis-a-vis the United States, taking advantage of the United States, language that President Trump has used, or do you think there's some mutual opportunity for improvement?
I think that there's mutual opportunity for improvement, and that's why you negotiate. But I think that Let's go outside of Europe, and let's just stipulate that the following caricature of the 20th century is accurate, which is that we had this thing called the Soviet Union, and the U.S. was in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and it was trying to sell liberalism around the world, both because it would make people's lives better, which it certainly did, but also to try to keep the Soviet Union from spreading its umbrella farther and farther. And one of the ways it did that was with trade policy that was, absolutely asymmetric, because we were willing to give them access to our market without worrying about what they did with their tariffs, because we were worried that they would be a satellite of the Soviet Union, and we wanted to bring them into, the modern liberal world. And I think that it was an incredibly successful experiment, but we're kind of mature, and at some point that we need to have an international trade structure that looks at the asymmetries that are there as a sort of as part of history, not an accident of history, and thinks about ways to improve them. And I don't think that we've made nearly enough progress on that. And again, if you read like the Otter or the Schott literature about the harm that China entering the WTO did to American communities, that it's something that really palpably affects our economy.
So you think tariffs are a way to reduce that harm? Or you think that's up to domestic policies to do?
I think that, I think that tariffs could be a way to reduce that harm. But I think domestic policy, again, I said I wanted to come back to my distressed communities. I think domestic policies are important as well. But again, think about the progress that we've made on getting the Europeans to increase their defense spending relative to GDP, a commitment that they've made. That there are a lot of things where people were kind of free riding on the U.S. that are starting to move in the right direction since the president's in the White House. And trade is part of that.
So we may come back to trade in the Q&A if people want to, but wanted to give you a chance to talk more about talk more about your work on distressed communities.
Yeah, so the work on distressed communities is something that I think is underappreciated, and it goes back to work I did with a group that was started a long time ago by Sean Parker and Ken Rogoff, and I don't know if Ken is here, were sort of founding advisors of that group called the Economic Innovation Group. And we did an enormous amount of research into geographic inequality. I know inequality is something that's studied a lot in the academic community, and they look at income inequality, and we found that the geographic inequality was really striking and even kind of expanding in the US. That people in poor communities, that there are places where the unemployment rate has been in the double figures for a decade, where there's skyrocketing substance abuse, and where somewhat puzzlingly people don't move like they used to. So it used to be if a place closed and it started to go south, then people would move, the kids would move. That was kind of something that came up in my confirmation hearing. That I grew up in Greenfield, Massachusetts, just about 80 miles that way, and when I was growing up, the Greenfield Tap and Dye closed, and it was the main employer in town, and the paper mill in Turner's Falls closed, which is right across the river. And so there were these two mill towns where suddenly the mills were gone, and almost none of my high school friends still live in the area. But today it's not quite like that. It says that there are these places that are suffering, and the people aren't moving away. And I think it might be because, in part, like suppose there are a lot of jobs in Cambridge, but what's it cost to get an apartment in Cambridge? And if you sold your house in a distressed community, then how many months rent would you get? Not many, right? And so you all know about that. There are a lot of people nodding their heads about that. But one thing that I found when I was doing the work on this was that if I asked a group like this, how many people here want to do something to help the distressed communities? And everybody would always stick their hands up, and I won't make us do the calisthenics right now, but I'm sure you would all do that. I want to help. And then I would say, how many people know how to help? And then no one would put their hand up. And I think that what we did at EIG, and then it became part of the tax law, is something that I'm really excited about. And I said in the New York Times a few months ago that we could look back and think it's the most important part of the tax bill, because what it is we've created a new organizational form in the US that allows you to help distressed communities. And here's how it works. It's very simple. We've made incentives, we've put into the law an incentive for private equity firms, mutual funds, investment companies to focus their investment in communities that are extremely distressed by very reasonable exogenous definitions of distress that are ultimately left to the states. And if they invest in those distressed communities and then keep investing in those distressed communities, then you can take your investment returns, you as an investor, and not pay tax on them until you cash out of the investment community, in which case you pay the normal capital gains tax. But the crucial thing is that you could take you two guys, I'm sure, since you were in grad school, put your savings in the Vanguard S&P 500 probably, right? But you can right now, under the new law, roll your unrealized capital gain into a distressed community fund and start putting your work into the distressed, or your wealth into the distressed community right now without a big tax penalty. And I think that what's going to happen as this spreads, and these funds are exploding in development right now, is that it's going to become a social norm that the wealthy in our country want to help the distressed communities, and that one of the ways they do that is that they take a fraction of their wealth and put it in the distressed community funds. I even expect that places like Google and Microsoft and everything will try to enforce the social norms with behavioral economics, where they default people in to investing some of their money into these things. And so I think that the Otter and Schott literature, one of the things it taught me was that this concentrated distress, in part because of China entering the WTO, is a really serious thing, and that we need to have innovative policy solutions to address it.
And what about the concern that this would be a pretty leaky bucket, and a lot of the benefit would go to high-income households that, say, had a lot of appreciated Facebook stock, sell it, pay zero capital gains, reinvest it somewhere else. They might have invested there anyway, zero capital gains on that, and you might be helping distressed communities, but sort of half the benefit is going to the high-income individuals, the other half to the distressed communities.
To be clear, that when you take your, say, since Sean was in on this, it's fair to say Facebook stock, I guess, because he's got some unrealized capital gain in Facebook. But if you take Facebook stock and then roll it into the Distressed Community Fund, then make some money in the Distressed Community Fund, and then take it out because you decide that you want to do something else with it or consume, then at that point you pay capital gains on the whole thing. And so the only thing that's happening, this is why the Joint Tax Committee, so this is think about it, it's this very innovative new thing. And the Joint Tax Committee estimated that over 10 years it costs, I think it was about $1 billion, $1.5 billion was the cost of this line. And it's because we're not forgiving the capital gains, we're just allowing you to take social action without penalizing you right now. And then if you decide to stop doing that, then we'll pay the tax that we were going to get from you anyway.
Great. We'll want to bring the questions to all of you now. There's 4 microphones, I guess. You can line up at them, identify yourself, ask a very brief question. If you ask 2 questions, then Kevin will talk about whatever he wants to, unrelated to either of your questions.
At AEI, we used to have the rule that it has to begin with a W word, your statement. And then somebody, right the very first time we gave that rule, started his question with, whereas.
Given the current run rate, I'm surprised there wasn't more of a discussion about federal deficits and the debt. How is it defensible to run large deficits, even during a period of robust growth where fiscal stimulus arguably is less necessary?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and the omnibus was something that the president has voiced his displeasure with. The spending increases were enormous. The revenue costs for the tax cut are a really small part of the problem, but they're, from Jason's point of view, that dynamic score of $1 trillion is something that drives him to distraction too. I think that any administration has to go through a sequence of policy roles, and the first one is cleaning up the messes that you inherited without criticizing or insulting the previous administration. And I think that you guys haven't even gotten to experience emotional Kevin talking about the International Corporate Tax Code, right? But we came up with this international tax code that was actually giving people tax refunds to build factories overseas, and it was just something that had to be addressed. And I think that the deficit problem is something that will have to be addressed. That if you look at it, it blows up the CBO models in the long run. The entitlements are not sustainable, and I think that will require bipartisan cooperation, and it's something that absolutely, I think that in the end the administration, absolutely the administration will have to turn to, because the spending is very much accelerating very quickly, and the tax revenues are not accelerating quickly, and so that those two things are inconsistent. I can say that Matt Jensen and I, long before I went into the administration, wrote a paper on fiscal consolidations. There's a big literature on this. And if you want to read up more, or maybe you already know the literature cold, but the thing that I find is the lesson of the fiscal consolidation literature is that there have been 2 attempts to get ahead of deficit problems, 2 styles. One is to say, let's be bipartisan, and there's one party in our country that wants higher taxes and one that wants lower government, and so we'll just split it 50-50. And then there have been others that have just recognized that the government being out of control is the problem. And they've tended to have their fiscal consolidations focus on reductions in government spending. And what Matt Jensen and I showed in our paper was that the 50-50 ones never worked. but the government spending reductions did. And so I think that probably it's because if you do something that would increase revenue, tax revenue, then next year's Congress is going to spend that money.
So just to be clear, you don't think the fiscal solution
I thought it was clear.
Includes both additional revenues and reduced spending? You think it's the same revenue level we have now or a lower revenue level plus spending cuts to close the gap?
I think that you need a bipartisan process, but I would bring forth the evidence from the fiscal consolidation literature and argue that spending reductions need to be the majority of the move.
Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you.
You mentioned that during the Cold War, we used trade policy to strengthen our allies during the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
Do you view China as a similar threat that needs to be dealt with in a similar way? And do we need to strengthen our allies as if in a similar Cold War? Or do you think China is not as much of a threat as the Soviet Union was?
I think that what needs to happen with China is that it needs to enter the community of nations and start behaving like everybody else. And so if Jason and I started a company and we were going to go operate in Germany, then they wouldn't insist that we joint venture with a German company. They wouldn't say, well, your secret formula for the extra lather you have to give to us too before you come, and so on. And I mentioned at lunch to Jason that there was covered in the media exchange with President Obama and the Chinese, I think in 2013, where he presented them with evidence of that we had collected of their military actually hacking into U.S. companies and stealing their intellectual property. And he said, you guys really got to stop this. And they promised they would stop it. I can't talk about stuff that's classified, but I could say that I think we should all hope that as China becomes the biggest economy in the world economy, that it needs to act like a steward of the global economy rather than a rogue that's willing to do things that are kind of outside the rules. And again, I think that they're in the WTO and you can challenge these things in the WTO, but it takes 6 years to get the thing resolved, and they're taking advantage of that inefficiency right now. Right. Do you disagree with that? Jason, do you disagree?
Our administration was very concerned with intellectual property theft by China. I think I'm a little bit torn as to how much is that versus contractual Pareto improving arrangement that American companies choose to enter into. And then I think there's another question of what to do about it. A lot of it is a WTO violation. So I think dealing with it multilaterally through the WTO, where we've been very successful in cases against China and working with our allies, is better than what appears to me to be a flatly WTO illegal way of doing it. So I think it's the magnitude of the problem. I'm not sure I'm convinced about how large it is. Our administration was, but the solution I think might be quite different.
For me, the analogy, and I know we have more questions, but I'll just finish with the analogy is that we've got speeding fines for people going above 80 miles an hour on Route 28, and the fine is 50 cents. And that's the way we've been trying to deal with the Chinese theft of intellectual property. Like the benefit to them of their successful theft is so large relative to the penalties that are imposed after years of WTO action that they haven't really felt discouraged from those actions. And I don't think that either administration has viewed that as acceptable. But we have a...
you. Sorry.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Betsy McGregor, and I'm pleased to be here with an international delegation from Lakefield College School in Canada. Mm-hmm. I wonder if your council, I thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if your council has had the opportunity, the advantage of applying gender-based analysis as a systematic tool for analyzing each of the economic policies that you're bringing forward. I know our Prime Minister in Canada is now applying this tool, GBA, and I'm wondering whether you measure the differential impact on men and women's lives in a country for ushering in an economic policy. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for that question. And there are many things that we're looking at all the time and measuring, and every time there's economic report of any kind, be it jobs or wages, we're tracking the impact on people of different races and genders. And I think you might have even noticed the president tweeting about these things. But if there's advances in gender-based analysis that you think I should be aware of, then I look forward to communicating with you about maybe more we could be doing.
Thank you so much. What's your email?
It's pretty easy to find, I think, actually.
If you send it to me, mine is on the web. I'll get it to Kevin. Yes.
Thank you so much, Kevin. My name is James, and I really appreciate for coming today. And it's such a rare opportunity to have like 1, 2, 3 associate professor, a former chair of the CA, coming to this stage. And my question is about the potential recession in the next few years, because just 6 weeks ago, there's an old guy sitting in the same seat saying that there will be 70% of the probability of a recession before 2020. Ray Dalio said that. And I just wonder, have you...
So I'm not an old guy. That's really good news. So I gotta go home.
So I just wonder that, from CEA perspective, have you do this kind of analysis of the worst case scenarios? And if there will be this kind of worst case, what will be the trigger? Is it going to be China and U.S. play really hardball on each other, or other potential triggers? Thank you.
Thanks. There's been a lot of work on recessions in the academic community, and one of my favorite scholars in this space is a guy at UCSD called Jim Hamilton, who's found that very often recessions tend to be preceded by big oil shocks. And if you go back in U.S. history, it was they shut the Suez Canal, they did this, the Iraq War was another one that caused an oil shock and gave a recession. And I think that's when you think about the pressure of public service, then one of the main pressures is that it could be that the world starts to have some serious trouble, and then you're the guy there that has to figure out what to do. And I can say that we've paid an enormous amount of attention to being prepared should something happen, so that we know what our plan is if there's all of a sudden a market panic or something like that. But we don't anticipate it right now. That if you look at it, the economy has a great deal of momentum. And I think that we're in a unique time in economic history, in that we're very deep into a recovery, but the recovery was one that was so capital poor that capital's contribution to productivity growth went negative. And now we've fixed a broken corporate tax code that was telling the capital to all go away. And it's all coming back, and you can see it coming back, and capital spending is going up. And so I'm extremely optimistic about the economy, because I think that we can sustain this recovery because the capital part of it has not happened yet, but there's a good reason to expect it to. And so, of course, there can always be some exogenous event that could cause a recession. I can tell you it's something that we've studied very carefully and have thought about what are we going to do. When I at CEA, or when Jason at CEA was building his team, he wanted to make sure that he had people around that would be really helpful in a crisis. I know Jim Stock, it'd be someone that you'd want to lean on. And that's probably one of the reasons why you brought Jim, is that he's probably the world's leading expert on recessions. It's not that you thought there was going to be a recession, but you wanted to have him around. But I don't think that Ray's right, that the odds right now are particularly high.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor and Dean, for this very deep dialogue. Question to Professor. Regarding China and the United States, President Trump has emphasized trade deficit. However, 3 concerns. Number 1, what if China includes the expenditure in import from the United States, such as Chinese expenditure on education, healthcare, securities, stocks, or buying directly from the United States as tourists or through agency or online? It would be worth hundreds of billions of US dollars every year.
Can you just make it, you're onto a good point, but just make it pretty concise so that we can get to Kevin.
Thank you. So, also, second, in 1971, Nixon ends dollar convertibility to gold. It means China exports products and services in exchange for US dollars, while United States maybe only need to print dollars. Third, when China buys a treasury bond, the likelihood of an American deficit would increase as well. So what do you think is setting up a barrier to reduce trade deficit in the US a good policy? And my question to Dean, ask what you can do. Say, in the current situation, when accepted, dispute settlement mechanism is abruptly abandoned like WTO. As student here, should we exercise leadership from a narrow conception of national interest or continue to influence our policymakers from a global perspective? Thank you.
There's a lot to respond to. I think that if you want to measure the trade balance better, we could talk about that. I'd have to study the matter. I know that there was actually this moment where I was talking about that on TV recently because of different measures. The Canadians and Americans have different measures of the trade balance that are really quite strikingly different. And there are a lot of difficulties in measuring the trade balance, for sure. It's an uncertain thing. So, for example, if you buy a product with a service contract, then exactly where do you allocate the service contract and the product and things like that. But I think that for sure there's a big trade deficit with China, and I think that the bigger concern in the economic report of the president that came out this year was the sort of misbehavior of China that seems like it's being repaired too slowly in the WTO process. And Jason was exactly right to say that there have been really, I guess, hundreds of cases brought against China in the WTO, and they've lost like 95% of them, but it hasn't really slowed the stuff we see about the way that they're coercing our companies into doing things that other countries aren't. And so again, way to think about it is that Jason and I open a company in China and we want to sell our soap, then China says, well, you have to have a joint venture with a local company. And so instead of having $100 of revenue, we have $50 of revenue. And that kind of practice hasn't been repaired through the WTO process. And I think that there are ongoing negotiations that even yesterday in the newspapers, if you look at that, there have been a lot of discussions about by Secretary Mnuchin and others in the government. And you guys should definitely be active. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks for being here. I wanted to ask you about international tax reform. You mentioned it in passing. We've already seen one company, an Ohio-based manufacturer, announce that it's redomiciling or pursuing a redomiciliation to the United Kingdom in recent months. So I wanted to ask, how far do you think the bill goes in really solving that issue? And does it actually simplify or for multinationals?
Yeah, I think that not just us at CEA, but others. There's some guys at the University of Mannheim that have very carefully modeled the international tax aspects, and we think that the benefit to locating in the U.S., as you might intuit from taking the rate from 35 to 21, has gone up enormously, and that the other thing is that the opportunity to use sort of very clever tax planning to move stuff offshore and keep it out of the U.S. tax base has gone down enormously. And I can, having worked as a consultant in tax litigation in the past, I could tell you that like an old trick is you put a manufacturer in Ireland, you make the widget that you sell in the U.S. for $10 in Ireland instead of the U.S., so already the import is going up by $10. But when you sell it to the parent in the U.S. before he sells it to the customer, you sell it for $15. And so then the parent posts a $5 loss, and the sub in Ireland has a massive profit, a return on capital of like 90% per year, and the U.S. Parent gets a tax refund because it paid taxes in the past, but not after it moved the plant to Ireland. And we can talk about the rates and stuff too, but there's something in the tax bill that makes that kind of game where you put extraordinary positive returns on firms outside the U.S., or subsidiaries outside the U.S., essentially impossible. And so what happens now is that you're allowed a kind of reasonable return on your tangible assets in a foreign country. I think it was 10%, if I remember right. And that's your deemed tangible income. And any extraordinary return above that is taxed in the U.S. Right away. And so I think that the international tax part of the tax bill is the part that's been the most carefully designed to fix a serious problem. The rate itself going to 21 would fix the problem a lot. But the international tax rules, which is really down in the weeds, are well designed. That said, that's going to be an enormous, still ongoing regulatory task for the Treasury staff. Unfortunately, the Treasury staff are really talented people, as Jason could tell you, but they've got a lot of rules to write to make sure that it works the way we intend.
So I'm sure Kevin would want to spend another hour on international tax. I know I would. I speak with sincerity. But our time is coming to an end. I just wanted to ask you the very last question. Maybe you could help us. What questions would you like to understand better that you think we genuinely don't know, need to do more research and thinking about? And you can just leave us with that thought.
Yeah, so because we've done a lot of sort of in the weeds stuff, but one of the big picture things that I've been thinking about, and there's a couple of Oxford professors, Chris Katarna and Ian Golden, that have written a book about this, but it goes back to sort of early information theory, and it'd be the kind of thing I might be working on if I wasn't in government. But you said, what's the thing that's really worth studying right now? I think that we underappreciate the fact that we've gone through, because of the information revolution, we've gone from a world where we kind of had curated information, where Walter Cronkite looked at everything and then told us what was important, to a world where that basically we're an oral society almost, where which is, I think, in the literature what they call it, where you kind of walk around the village and ask people what's going on, and everybody tells you, and you have to decide what the truth is. And so that now there's a competition for our attention, and the competition for our attention has replaced the curated information. And I think that what Golden and Katarna argue is that that's what happened in the Renaissance, that they invented the printing press, and nobody had any books, and then all of a sudden there were millions of books, and most of the books were the ones that had been banned by the church, and so that a whole bunch of world history came about because of an information revolution. And I think that we're living in an information revolution right now, and deciding how it plays out is something that I'm just very obsessed with, because it's a really hard question, and I'm not really sure what the right answer is. But you hear people talk about fake news and competition, but it's really something that was anticipated by McLuhan and everybody else who started to look forward to the age that we live in. And so I think that what the 21st century information technology is and how it affects society is something that I think is a really good, I think, fertile area for research.
Great. Well, join me in thanking Chairman Kevin Hassett for sharing his thoughts with us today.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you so much.